How much of a loss do you think it is for this Mets team to not have ended up with him?
Well, I think that they have enough talent right now to win the division in the NL East. And, it's always about who you're competing against, obviously, not only within your division, but within the National League to get to the World Series. They have a little ways to go to catch, I think, the Dodgers now that Bauer has signed, and in terms of chasing that World Series appearance and World Series title that Steve Cohen, Sandy Alderson are trying to get. But their pitching right now is strong enough. I still would like to see if they could get a little bit more depth until Syndergaard comes back, and maybe that's a Taiwan Walker or Jake Odorizzi or somebody along those lines. But they also have the room to go out and get a center fielder if they want with Jackie Bradley Jr. They could add a relief pitcher. There's some things that they could do to be better. And I think for me, as much as I like Bauer as a pitcher, I think there would have been some issues in New York if he struggled out of the gate. And so, I think with this, time will tell. But if he doesn't want to be in New York, I think it's better to turn the page and see if they can improve in some other areas for the Mets.
I agree with Jim on all points, but highlighting your last point, Jim, this was always a dicey proposition for the Mets, but look, whether Bauer's behavior was harassment, whether it was this or that, I'm not in the business of trying to label these things or compare them to what other men have done that have been associated with the Mets. But he made people feel uncomfortable online. He made women feel comfortable online. We know what he is. He's, I believe, a 30-year-old man. It's not as if you're going to change overnight when you sign with a new team. So that's the whole package that the Mets would have been importing with the context of what's going on with Jared Porter and Mickey Callaway. Different offenses, but still, one of the things that would have also led to is for all that money that the Mets would have spent, it wouldn't have been a clear PR win. When I've been reporting, on this on Twitter, you'll see the replies sometimes, and there's fans going, "Go get him," and there's a lot of fans going, "Please don't, Sandy, don't bring this guy to New York," especially after what's happened. So the introductory press conference for an historic outlay of cash would have been filled with questions about what kind of diligence did you do, and was this harassment or wasn't? And even on day one, it wouldn't have been just that PR win that you hope when you spend all that money. And then, as Jim pointed out, spinning it forward, there's the potential for things to happen in the future with a mercurial personality. Look, Bauer's entertaining. People that have dealt with him one-on-one like him, I don't want to paint him as some monster. I'm not trying to do that. But we know that there's the potential, especially in New York, for some things to get out of control if he doesn't perform.
One more note here from Jeff Passan. He says the Mets offered a higher overall value than the Dodgers, but those numbers in the first 2 years of Bauer's deal are massive, and making him the highest paid player in baseball history was certainly appealing to him. Who wouldn't it be appealing to? Andy, so let's talk about pivots. Jim mentioned some names to add to that rotation depth. I would add James Paxton maybe to that list if the Mets like him as a potential add there. What about Jackie Bradley Jr.? We've heard high numbers potentially from his side. Do you think the Mets see that as their next potential pivot?
Look, I think they're in pretty good shape with the rotation. Carlos Carrasco was a big get, and they've got depth now, too. Obviously, you've got Peterson. They've signed some really good depth guys, whether it's Yamamoto from the Marlins or others. They've added nicely. Paxton had a showcase a while back, which, unlike Kluber, did not generate a ton of interest. Makes you wonder. Paxton's a great guy, a great pitcher. I hope he's doing okay. But I think it's interesting that we haven't heard a ton there. And as far as your Bradley question, Doug, they've been in on Bradley. They've been talking to him. He has wanted a significant contract. We've been talking about that for a while. 4 or 5 or more years, $15, $20 million a year, something like that would be where Scott Boras and Bradley are at. So we'll see. But now that you haven't spent that money on Bauer, they really can make decisions like that. And I think improve their club. I think because the Mets rotation is already good, you can make an argument, a baseball operations argument, that their roster will be better off by spreading these resources around a bit.
I've talked to you both enough about front offices and the way they think to know that they don't think like fans, right? So to Andy's earlier point, the Mets had that window where they were comfortable with Trevor Bauer. He didn't accept it. And now they probably just move on, Jim, but they move on having not spent money on George Springer, having not spent money on Trevor Bauer. And I think there's a lot of Mets fans at home who are upset about that. But, Jim, what about the front office view then on using that money that you've now saved on somebody like Francisco Lindor an extension or Michael Conforto an extension?
Well, I think that's another thing that kind of goes without saying. They missed out on Realmuto too, but they obviously had gotten McCann. I think you're in this point where if you're going to wait this long in the wintertime, you better have most of your roster set, and luckily the Mets do. And so I think with most of these guys, the main guys are off the table. You see what else can fit within your roster that you can add on either short-term or long-term basis. Nothing to that degree of those high-impact guys, and then you turn your sights towards keeping Lindor and Conforto. I always felt that it was not an either or; it was both. How could they go down both paths? So if they got Bauer, it might impact how much you could pay Lindor or Conforto, but the hope was that they could afford all of them. And so I think at some point you certainly go down that road of trying to sign those guys up prior to opening day for both. I know Conforto said he didn't want it to be a distraction. Lindor sounded like he didn't want it to go into the course of the season. But I think you can do both. You can still improve the team, add the depth that you're hoping for, but also try to ink both of those players to long-term deals.